Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today to receive this presentation being presented by Sharon McCarthy, one of our colleagues in the home care field. The subject of our day for discussion is post-traumatic stress disorder. And Sharon has done a very superb job of putting together the content of this, and I'm going to turn it over to her immediately so that she can then take us to the direction she wants us to go. So Sharon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon. Today we are discussing PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a potentially debilitating anxiety disorder triggered by a traumatic experience or event. Trauma is a result of any emotionally or physically life-threatening events such as assault, car accidents, domestic abuse, natural disasters, prison stay, sexual assault, terrorism, or war. It can occur after one has gone through extreme emotional trauma that involves the threat of injury or death, or any perceived danger. There are several clusters of symptoms that distinguish PTSD. 1. Re-experiencing the trauma, flashbacks. 2. Avoidance, emotional numbing. And 3. Hypervigilance, always perceiving danger, as well as negative thoughts, agitation, irritability, excitability, and paranoia. Doctors do not know why traumatic events cause PTSD in some people but not in others. Your genes, your emotions, and family settings, dynamics may all play a role. Treatments are counseling, talk therapy, cognitive therapy, desensitization, and sometimes medication. Living with addiction, self or a family member, can be emotionally or physically traumatizing as well. In my experience as an addiction counselor, I've seen many people with this anxiety disorder. So I would like to talk about PTSD in relation to substance abuse. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a condition formerly known during World War II as battle fatigue. In an addictive relationship, whether you are the addict or an alcoholic or the co-alcoholic, which is an enabler often, you are often in a battle for your life and your sanity. Generally, there is emotional, verbal, and physical trauma. There is often a disconnect, and we need to find recovery and come to a spiritual place of understanding in our life in order to overcome and survive. Frequently, one is diagnosed with panic disorder, anxiety, schizophrenia, manic depressive, or bipolar, and often put on meds. The effects of the disease results in depression that is sometimes misdiagnosed. Sometimes the co-alcoholic enabler gets sicker than the one using. It is a paradox. Children often get angry at the non-user or partner because of the dysfunction and enabling and craziness that results. The entire family is victimized by the effects of the disease. It escalates and exacerbates into a merry-go-round of denial, covering and protecting. Sometimes relationships survive, but rarely. Sometimes, miraculously, they do, but not without a lot of emotional damage that will take years to come to terms with. If one is lucky enough to be able to find the right road to recovery, it can be a blessing in disguise. It is not always a doomed future, but it is not without its challenges. It takes a lot of hard work and resolve to overcome the effects of addiction. It is a long and winding road, this road to wellness, with a lot of speed bumps along the way. One needs to decide that they will not be held prisoner to addiction in any form, physically, emotionally, or spiritually. With the right treatment, we can turn our lives around and take control of our future and overcome the debilitating effects of the disease and refuse to be victimized by our past. It is an amazing experience to be able to see the world and our lives from a different perspective. It is in changing our thinking from catastrophic, victimization, the blame and shame of ourselves and others, to living in the now, in the present. This takes addiction treatment, proactive counseling, support groups, 12-step programs, and changing our environment if possible. To being grateful that we have this moment in time to make amends and move on. The mind is an amazing thing. It will rerun over and over again situations, circumstances, and grievances. If we are not clear in our thinking, it will become a train wreck. We have a choice to look at any given situation from a positive or negative point of view. The glass half full or half empty analogy, both the same thing, just viewed from a different perspective. One makes you feel hopeful and the other does not. This is what happens with PTSD or many forms of depression. Sufferers tend to replay and re-experience the trauma over and over with no sense of escape. There is a feeling of hopelessness. Symptoms often occur long after the event or events. It can be years before the effects of living in an addictive relationship with all of its destruction catches up and results in physical and emotional symptoms that are terrifying. Panic attacks seem to come out of nowhere. One begins to retreat and not leave their home, hypervigilant to danger, paranoia. Trouble sleeping, nightmares, anger, mood swings, and debilitating depression. Unable to function in the world, hold a job, take care of responsibilities. Living with addiction can have the same effect on a person as people who have witnessed devastating wars and catastrophes or tragic accidents or physical abuse of others. As in any challenge in life, addiction recovery takes work. It will take years to overcome and understand the history that brought one to a place of desperation. There is an undeniable sadness that often takes years to break through, and anger that takes years to forgive. No one said it would be easy. No one said there is a magic bullet. Diet, exercise, support, relaxation, techniques, spirituality, counseling, massage, and healing music and yoga, stepping inside of others' experiences by reading about others' struggles and recoveries. Self-help books, biographies, and autobiographies are a good way to get out of self and relate and identify with others who have walked your walk or run your marathon, whatever the case may be. All are tools to use to change and modify our behaviors in ways that will begin to clear our minds, to change our thinking. It is truly in our thinking that holds the key to success on this journey. Desensitizing and talk therapy is essential, being willing and proactive in using the tools of recovery. Many people believe that one can get well without the use of drugs when clinically diagnosed. Although there is a lot of controversy, pros and cons, I believe that under the right circumstances we can approach recovery without the use of pharmaceuticals. However, sometimes they are necessary depending on individual circumstances and situations. PTSD is overwhelming, and the depression and anxiety that develops is terrifying and all-consuming. If one can hold on long enough, if one can believe and not give up, there is hope. Yes, addiction can be debilitating, but to be emotionally, physically, and spiritually in the moment as a result of recovery can be incredibly freeing. Then you can see the possibilities. Thank you. So there is also some medical reference here. There are 3 pages that I put together as well that you can go through if you would like. It's a little more in-depth than what we just discussed, so it may answer some further questions. But are there any questions or comments?
I'm interested to know what you understand to be effective results of PTSD treatment. How would you know when someone has effectively reached a changed place in their life? What will you see?
Well, I did mention a little bit about desensitizing, and I think it's crucial to have therapy which is working through that, facing the fear. So it's almost like aversion therapy. If one talks to a trusted counselor and they really work on what they are faced with, I think it's definitely possible. I know it's definitely possible.
Would an example be like if you're in a counseling setting, that with someone you really trust, would an example of developing aversion, would that be like role playing with your counselor, how to respond to a confrontation from the person who triggers you?
Some of that.
Is that an example of what you mean by aversion?
Some of that. And there are a lot of people who have anxiety about going places, different places. So it's, working up to that, working with a counselor. There are counselors who will work with you that way, go into stores, driving, whatever the case may be, where there is a fear that is built up. Also, a lot of fear of society, social experience. People need to experience getting back socially as well. And there are also things that trigger that are, it has to do with our thinking. It's the way we see things, it's perspective. So someone may be triggered by something that isn't even, it may be not a true
Not real.
danger, and
Not-
it may not
yeah.
be real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I know some people in my life where they were in a social, if they were in a specific type of social setting, they were triggered, anxiety-wise, and then they would medicate themselves
Right.
with alcohol or some other substance,
Happens
marijuana or whatever it was, or sometimes it would be, they go and consume food. They would just like overindulge in food.
Yes.
Because I'm assuming any type of addictive behavior probably proceeds pretty readily from PSTD.
PTSD.
Or I always get it wrong.
I know a lot of people.
PTSD.
Yes.
Is that true in your experience of your research that perhaps that there is more of a correlation between addiction and this disorder?
Absolutely, which is why I touched on
The
PTSD when you are living with addiction or someone, a loved one who has addiction.
Yeah.
It's like being in a war zone often.
Yeah.
Because using, only exacerbates these issues and
Right.
these problems,
Right.
obviously.
Right.
But a lot of people will self-medicate. And there was a footnote on page 5.
Page 5.
Where
Yeah.
I referred to marijuana use in psychosis.
Yes.
There is such a thing. Marijuana has been proven to contribute to psychosis in long-term users as well. So this is something that a lot of people are not aware of, and although I am, I think the right thing to do, and this is just my opinion, I think medicinally I am in favor of that. I think that it is helpful for some people. However, when one is medicating themselves with alcohol or any drug or marijuana, it's a whole different thing. There are a lot of people who smoke marijuana trying to handle this anxiety that they're feeling. And the marijuana that you're getting on the street, first off, is very different than it was years and years ago. And it's very different than medicinal marijuana. Medicinal marijuana is a lot cleaner. So, I know there's a lot of controversy about whether it should be legal or not, all that aside. Personally, I don't think that alcohol or marijuana is the problem. I think it's the addiction. So therefore, we could eliminate a lot of that, but that's just my personal opinion. Probably I don't know. I'm just putting that out there. I do see a lot of people who do drink or do other drugs, pharmaceuticals as well, or marijuana to try to control their anxiety. And that is so counterproductive. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, can you share, it seems most of the symptoms that are exhibited under this disorder or this trauma disorder, PTSD, are emotional and psychological. Are there any physical ramifications that come forward, or physical consequences that come forward over long term with this disorder?
Well, I would think so, because when your body is in stress mode, there's a lot of
true.
hormones that are being released that are
Right.
damaging our organs, right?
Yeah. The adrenaline is always running and so on.
Yeah.
So they're always in high gear.
Yeah, and I think it does cause a lot of disease because you're not paying attention to diet, you're not paying attention, and relaxation is so important, in recovery, which is why meditation and healing music and biographies and autobiographies, once one steps into someone else's experience, it's amazing how that can change your feelings and your perspective, because you understand. One, you're not alone. There are other people out there experiencing things. Support groups are essential because it's very important to talk through our feelings, and also to have a trusted support person. I think, and there are several different types of anxiety disorders, panic disorders, and several.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So post-traumatic stress disorder is one of many.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, this is why I thought it was so important to talk about it with living with addiction. Because it really is like you're battling for your life and your sanity. It's like you've been in a war.
Well, I like the way you brought this to us because it expands the whole idea of stress resulting from trauma outside of a war environment. Typically, people associate this disorder with soldiers and people coming back from a war or victims of a war.
Well, and that's why
But
it used to be
in essence,
called-
like you mentioned, we are in a war if we're in a drug-addicted environment all the time.
Right, whether with yourself or with your family.
Right.
And that's why it also impacts the children too, you know, because actually the non-alcoholic or drug addict often gets sicker than the one using.
Yeah.
Because it's craziness. You know,
Right.
they're trying to keep order
Yeah.
and control everything, and that's why we become enablers. That's why we enable, which means enabling the user, the alcoholic or the drug addict, to continue their addiction, because we're covering, we're protecting, we're denying, you know, and our children see this. And then they also see a lot of the emotional and verbal abuse that goes on. It just, you know, it's a given. When there is addiction, that's what happens in a family environment.
Right.
So that's why the children get angrier with the non-user often.
I think, from my knowledge too of the addiction model for families, the position of someone in a family also affects their ability to cope with the circumstance or what style of coping they choose in that circumstance. And with
This
that
is true,
said,
you mean in the children?
yeah, using
Where-
children, you
whether
know,
they're
hierarchy
first,
of
second, yes.
their birth
Yes,
status
true.
has an effect upon how they cope.
So true.
Along with that, has it been your experience, or how would you respond to the question of, is PSTD, how do I want to say this? The idea I have in my mind is you've got the person who is really messed up, and we know they're medicating themselves or they're doing something to try to cope. Then you have all the people around that individual. Is it a case sometimes that the disorder will show itself more in the people around this crazy person or this person who's doing these terrible things to himself or herself, and that person isn't really suffering PTSD, but everybody else
PTSD.
around them is suffering it?
Yes, because when you're living with craziness, you become crazy.
Okay.
So there is craziness.
Okay, yeah, so it's contagious.
Every member, it's very contagious.
It's contagious.
Yes, because there is no way to maintain any sense of normalcy or any sense of healthy, functional family environment when you're living with insanity and craziness. It just, you know, there is no reasoning with insanity, as they say.
Right.
And so you are trying to make sense of this nonsense around you and all this craziness, and you love these people. And you're trying to, and so I think what happens is one goes into denial themselves. We go into denial when we're dealing with this because we don't want to believe it's like that.
Yes.
That is where the dysfunction comes in. And that you can't be real, you can't be truthful. You can't be real and truthful not only to your own family members, but you can't be
everybody
real and
else.
truthful to the outside world. So you're living two worlds.
Yeah.
You know, you're two different people, you're divided, you're split. And that makes you crazy.
Yeah.
Because when there isn't truth, knowing our own truth is absolutely what makes us healthy and what brings about recovery.
Yeah.
Maintaining our own, knowing our own truth and maintaining that. Because
Helps
otherwise,
with recovery is what you're saying.
absolutely, absolutely. Because I don't think there can be recovery until you're absolutely honest
Yes.
and forthright and truthful, right? Not only with
Yeah.
yourself, but with the other people around you and in your outside world. And then that trickles down into your work environment and everything socially, right?
Right.
That's why everybody gets so isolated when they're living with addiction. because socially, forget it.
Right, and what you're telling us is if we are in a condition where we're living in this environment, we can salvage ourselves.
Yes,
We don't have to, I mean, yes, we want to see the person that's
yes.
troubling us get well also. But perhaps it's more important for me to start out with taking care of me than it is for me to worry about taking care of and fixing that other person.
And how does one do that?
I don't know.
By
Well, I
getting-
do know, but tell us what you think.
We do that by getting out of the environment.
Okay.
Absolutely. If
Yeah.
it's, you know, if we get to a place where we recognize that this person is not open to getting well, and we want to be well, we have to change the environment, get out of the environment, and work on ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't reintegrate at some point, but I'm a big advocate of getting out of the environment because it's very healthy to try it, as well as you can.
Yeah.
I mean, that isn't always possible for some people financially if they're not ready to leave completely. But, and a lot of people will stay because they choose to, but then there again, that brings something else up. If once we get into recovery and we choose to stay, that is a choice. We choose to stay, we're there because we chose to stay. So that changes the whole dynamic because you realize that you're no longer trying to change that other person
Not a victim.
and control that other person. You, absolutely, that's it. You're out of the victimization.
You're not a victim.
And once we get out of being a victim, then we can move on and move forward. So that's why, as I say, it doesn't always mean that it's the end of relationships or it's a doomed future. You know, there are relationships that survive, and a lot of people will get their own recovery once we get our recovery too. And it just takes time. I mean, and I saw that as a counselor. I saw that over and over, you know, in many different people that I counseled. And in their relationships, some relationships didn't survive and some did. And it's a matter of choice, I think, and changing our thinking, regardless of what we're dealing with. It all has to do with our thinking, how we perceive things, our perspective, because when we change our thinking, then the way we view things and see the world and others changes. When we change our thinking. So.
Well, actually, I guess it is on here. I was looking at your list that you stated earlier about some things that bring about this disorder.
What page are you on?
The very first one. Today we are discussing PTSD, and then you list trauma is a result of any emotionally or physically life-threatening event, such as, and you gave some examples. One that isn't on your list that I think of is loss of employment.
Yes.
And it isn't as, I don't
And
think
there are
it's
many
as,
others.
yeah, I don't think it's as common as some of these other ones you listed, but when we look at, when you read the newspaper or you listen to the news and you hear about all these people who are killing others as a result of losing something like their job or,
Yes.
you know, going back into their work environment and shooting their colleagues. And I wonder too how this disorder is related to any of the traumas that we've had where young people have done the same things, where they've gone into schools and conducted themselves in a manner, you know, less than the way we would want them to. Maybe it isn't related at all, but
I think it is.
you know, I don't know enough about
related.
some of their backgrounds, obviously, because they don't put that out in public, but it would be interesting to know if there was any type of trauma in their life that, and I suppose that that's investigated when they look at these young people that do these things, I would assume.
My experience in my research has been that there's always trauma.
Always
but I
trauma.
don't think any of us get out of life unscathed. I
Right,
think that we all have
right.
trauma.
Of course.
And it's just how we all handle it.
Yeah.
Some of us, like, and I think I referred to that, doctors don't know why. Some people, you know, anxiety disorders become so prevalent and PTSD is such a problem for some and not others.
Right.
I mean, some people can go through life without so much as a backward glance and experience the same thing, the same kind of trauma, and it doesn't impact them. Somebody else, they would absolutely devastate. So, yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with how we interact from the time we're very young, what goes on in our world and our family, and how that is handled, of course. And they are beginning to see a lot of that. Also, too, you know, medications. There's pros and cons, and know that, and we've discussed this.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, medications will have contrary. With a lot of these young men that have gone out and shot up a lot of, in answer to your question, they had been on medication at one time.
Yeah.
And they stopped taking the medication. So who's to say what happens metabolically to the body?
Right.
And is that, in fact, the way to treat these disorders? That is a question, isn't it?
It is a question, yeah, and it still
And a
remains an
lot
open
of them
question.
have all
Yeah.
been on medications
Yeah.
and then went absolutely spastic. So that's something to look at.
Right.
And
Well, they were on
I
medication.
think we are an over-medicated society.
Well, I don't disagree, although you could look at it from the standpoint that they were on the medication. While they were on the medication, they weren't exhibiting the extreme effects of the disorder. It was being controlled by the medication. When they stopped the medication, then they released that inner disorder in its full capacity, and that's when they conduct themselves in this terrible way.
Or it becomes worse.
Or it gets worse because
Because of the medication and because of stopping it so abruptly. I think that's very true, that if one is on medication, you can't, they say that, not to stop it
Oh, yeah.
abruptly. But, there is a lot of controversy about all of this. And the
True.
media, all these things play in, feed into all of that, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, our world is just, we live in quite a world today. And what's on TV, what the kids see,
Yeah.
on the internet, I mean, all these things come into play,
Yes, they do.
I think. So as a society, we need to make change. And I guess we all need to ask ourselves how we're going to do that. We can't
we do
it
that
overnight.
individually.
We do that individually, absolutely, which is one of the reasons that I was drawn to the field of counseling. To just try to give back in the way that I could, in a small way.
Yeah.
And I did. I enjoyed it and loved it. And, sharing a little bit of ourselves and our experience is important, I think. I think we all need to share what we've been through so that other people know that, we're all the same. Nobody's any different. We've all hit, rough patches and get through it, hopefully. And if we can share with other people how we got through that, I think that's a good thing to do. And I know my listening to a lot of people way back, when I was trying to figure things out about a lot of what we just discussed with family and otherwise. Listening to other people tell their stories was very helpful for me. Yeah.
Well, what about how do you know when someone's story is not true? It's just a made-up story.
And there is a lot of that, isn't there?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, based on my experience myself as a counselor. But
Yes.
what's it been like for you in terms of your work in this particular area?
I think there is such a thing as false memory.
False memory. Talk about that, please.
I think that sometimes, but again, that has to do with our thinking. Has to do with how centered a person is and their thinking. Some people can actually believe that they've experienced certain things and haven't. Because maybe there was a little part of that was true and real. But then it got, especially if they're a drug addict or an alcoholic, it brings in a lot of all that craziness that we're talking about. Now, if a child is young and they're seeing mom and dad fight and there's a lot of screaming and hollering going on and maybe there's something on the TV, or I think memory is an amazing thing. And I do think that there are certain things, certain times, and I have had that experience as a counselor, where, I came to understand that, maybe this is a false memory. Maybe this is not reality. However, it's their reality because they really believe it. And then there are others who know absolutely that they're making things up, like a lot of people who are, saying they were abused, who in fact probably weren't. And they're using it. So there is all of that. And I just think that the more centered we are, the more intuitive we become.
Yeah.
So that we know, when one is being truthful or not. I think the more that the more centered that we get, and the more we get into recovery and wanting to own our own truth, I think there's a certain knowledge and intuitiveness that we gain because that has just been my experience. And I think anybody can gain that understanding and that knowledge and that sensitivity to really know truth, not only for yourself but others. There's a certain intuitiveness, I think. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. I once encountered a professional psychologist named Sid Wolf back in the 60s. Well, actually it wasn't 60s, it was in the 80s, who purported that every human being has an innate ability to counsel another human being. That we know how to do it instinctively, it's an inherited trait. But most of us avoid doing it, or we do it poorly because we don't give ourselves the ability to develop it as a skill.
Very interesting.
We don't take the time to develop it as a skill. And the principles he said were necessary were the ability to listen actively to another person, which means you ask questions, you acknowledge, you feedback, and you pay attention to what the person is communicating, to be assertive in how you respond when someone is communicating with you. Either they're communicating behaviorally or they're communicating by words.
Either positive or negative, to respond in the moment.
Yes, but to do so assertively,
Yes.
which means you use I statements, not you statements. And because a you statement points a finger at the other person.
Yes.
Rather than pointing it at you and taking ownership of it.
Yes.
And then the third idea was to allow for compassion, to let yourself be empathetic, not sympathetic necessarily, although there is appropriate times for sympathy, but the real key emotion is empathy. It's being able to say, I know how you feel, and really know it, not just think you know it, or not, if I've never shot somebody before in my life, I can't say to someone, I know how you feel when you did that.
Exactly.
But if I have been in a fist fight with another person somewhere in the course of my life, and I was really angry at the time I was in that fist fight, I can say to this other person that I'm talking with who just had a fist fight, you know what, I can really relate to the anger you were feeling at that moment, because I've been there and I've done that. So that point you just made, or you're right, or after, but the point you just made about being able to relate directly to the experience or the emotion the person is having is really important. So I truly, like you, think when we come out of our own stuff, we have so much more to give to other people around us, whether they're our loved ones or they're our friends, whom we may love or just be acquaintances with, but the world at large, we have more to offer. I know I did when I came out of the garbage that I went through when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I did have it. I had life trauma just like a lot to people have.
Well, I think it's very important to be kind but firm.
Kind but firm.
When there's aggression, when you're involved with aggression, to still be kind but firm. And then, as you were saying, compassion. That's essential. Compassion is so important. And everyone doesn't receive it either. So if one does not want to receive what you have to offer, well, then it's time, but not to completely write them off, but just let them be. You know what I'm saying? If they come to us, I think it's important to still be there. But there are some people who will not receive what we have to give, and so they're on their own journey, and we can't save everyone, and that often has to do with family members too.
Right.
But that's why they called it what we were talking about as far as PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. That's why in World War II, that's where the term came from, because they called it battle fatigue. Well, in an addiction, you're battling all the time.
You are, either with yourself or with your addiction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I have a question. In counseling, would the counseling be different for PTSD and addiction? we've been discussing this, that the trauma, they can self-medicate and become addictive and self-medicating, but is the counseling process similar for the PTSD versus, let's say, someone with...
Counseling, I think, from my experience, regardless of what one is in counseling for, it's all the same, basically.
Mm-hmm.
What you are addressing may be different, and how you go about that may be different. But it's all about, as Alan was saying before, listening, having empathy, compassion, being kind but firm. And it's really important, a lot of people, resolution. Healing doesn't happen unless there's resolution. So a good counselor will walk through trying to resolve things with people in the way that that person needs it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a special counseling,
No.
you don't have a special shingle for
For PTSD?
yeah,
No.
no, I just...
No. You mean,
Well, what are are there any statistics to people that do recover? In the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the recent movie American Sniper, that this gentleman, or this veteran, was helping other Marines, and a fellow Marine, he was trying to make his own life productive, and was murdered. I don't know if it was
how
claimed that the fellow that was shooting had PTSD. I don't,
I actually read that book, and I saw the movie. And there's a lot of controversy about that, isn't there now? Whether or not a lot of the facts were correct.
I
However,
haven't read
what
the
your question is, what I hear you saying, is that here's this guy who came back after being in war, and he was reaching out, and actually the mother had asked this man, Kyle,
to buddy up with.
This young man. So he went with a friend. So what you're saying is, how sad is that? That this man was trying to reach out to this young man and then lost his life? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's more from the young man, the son of the mother that made the request. Was he in therapy? Do these veterans go through? Is there any standard operating procedure? Are there any statistics that the ones that go through treatment are the ones that are these mass?
If they have success.
Yeah. Is there success? I know it's as much as they are willing to be honest. I understand that it's their own journey, what they're going to put into it.
I think it would be very difficult for anyone who has seen war I think it changes you, absolutely. And I think I did have someone who was on my caseload who had been a Navy SEAL, actually. And he didn't really elaborate and go into too much detail because it was very hard for him. But I found it very interesting to see him as he journeyed through his recovery, because he did do very well towards the end. It was a 9-month program where I worked at the
Once a week?
Salvation Army. No,
I just
a
wondered how
9-month, it was residential.
Oh,
He lived
in-house.
there. Yeah, it was in-house, and he lived there in that program. And he did graduate and recover and do well, as far as I could observe. Who knows what goes on inside someone's
The
head.
struggles.
And I will tell you this, that one of the other things that I am advocating for, and I have a heart for it, is that I think in this country, your question was, what is the percentage of recovery? Is that the question?
Do we have information?
We have information on addiction recovery, and unfortunately in this country, it is less than
10%?
It is less than, well, I was going to say 20%, but now it's probably
For addiction?
for addiction recovery.
Less
It
than
is a
20%.
revolving door.
Yeah.
And what happens is there is a model of recovery in Finland for addiction, homelessness, all kinds of issues. And what they do in their recovery, how they try to help people in their recovery system, is that they will work on farms with the land, with animals and planting, and they have an 80%, almost 90% success rate in recovery of addicts, people who are homeless, mentally ill, and of course people who are homeless are both mostly addicts and mentally ill. You have a lot of mental illness with the homeless, is what I mean to
I'd be
say.
interested in knowing what that study is. Do you think that's because they find that, I would
Yes.
think that you find value
Yes.
in work and doing something well.
Absolutely.
And the land and the animals do not
Yes.
judge you.
Exactly, and
They
they work
don't.
with horses and all kinds of animals, and they are seeing such a great success in anything that people are dealing with. Like I said, even mental illness, or people who have any type of addiction, people who've been homeless and out on the street, and they've been duly diagnosed. But it doesn't matter. In their recovery, in the way they are approaching recovery with people, which makes sense, doesn't it? Why?
So forth.
Of course. In our society, the other thing is they don't push meds. Here, our first line of defense is
It's a
medication.
pill.
Is there something with the pharmaceutical companies
Yeah.
here?
Absolutely.
You think?
Absolutely.
Yes.
They spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to reveal their so-called miracle cures to physicians who have the authority to prescribe, and now nurse practitioners who have the authority to prescribe, and physicians' assistants who have the authority to prescribe.
And it's very easy to write a prescription than to really sit down and put your
counsel.
heads together and try to figure out what might be best for this one person. And the other thing is, okay, so you go to the doctor and you have maybe 15, 20 minutes tops.
Mhm.
They used to have 45 minutes to an hour squared off to see people. Now, so all of these things I think that we're talking about is just, it's our society. So we need to make changes as much as we can in all of these areas, and I think that we would see results. But I think as far as recovery, I know it is possible. It's just sitting with the right person who's, as Alan was saying, listening and hearing, who's actually hearing, not just, writing and, listening that way, but actually hearing you and caring enough. Connection. What is the biggest drawback to recovery? Isolation.
Right.
Isolation is one of the biggest drawbacks, which is why these recovery systems that we're talking about in Finland and elsewhere that are having such great results work, because it's a family environment, it's a community, and a lot of our addiction treatment has to do with 30 days does nothing. So if you go to a treatment center for 30 days, forget it. I mean, it's like, okay, so that's just the tip of the iceberg. It takes years for full, true recovery to happen. And it takes connecting with people. And it takes being socially involved, which is why 12-step programs work. Because it's a social interaction, and when people work it, the program works for a lot of people. Because you're getting connected, and you may not have a family over here because of all the addiction issues and all of that in the past, but then you're making new connections which isn't always easy either. Because some people in 12-step programs can be just as judgmental as,
Oh, yeah.
the
They're
outside
people.
world.
They're people.
But it's a forum, and it's a beginning. And 12-step programs, it is a beginning of getting out there and, getting in touch with other people and trying to connect. And in addition to counseling, in addition to service. I think service is very healing, however we can find that, But that takes time. We have to get our head on straight first. It's hard to, think about any of those things when you can't put one foot in front of the other. That will take time, but it will come, it's definitely a process.
To use the cliche, you cannot overcome an addiction until you recognize you're powerless over it and give into it and let yourself realize it. And then once you've acknowledged it and you make the decision to do something differently than what you're doing, that's when all of these other points that Sharon has brought up start to be important. And when you look at well, when you look at the Finland model, for example, it's government funded. The people in Finland, all of their healthcare is covered by the country. It's not covered by private enterprise.
So what does that tell you as well?
Well, it tells us a lot.
That's something
They're
we
more
need to
successful.
change here as well.
Right.
Well, I was
Because
wondering-
in America,
It is
when you
sad.
go to a 30-day program, you spend thousands of dollars to go there, or your insurance company does. They are not cheap. And the other thing about it that I've learned is, and I know this from personal experience as a counselor of substance abusers myself, I often had to accept that users would continue to use even though they were coming to my office weekly for counseling. And it took sometimes months of counsel before they were fully willing to say, to let go of the use. Gradually, nipping away with them in sessions and talking and developing trust, opening up the can of worms with them, helping them to look at realities around them, suddenly they have an awakening. It's like the crisis occurs of a consciousness, and they finally say, aha, you're right. All of these months I've been coming here, yes, I've still been using, but you plant, it's like you've become my conscience counselor. You brought to my attention ideas that I was putting away, I was denying, I was ignoring, I was not believing. And you've helped me to realize that I need to stop this. So what's the next step? And then you've got them in a place where they can go to a treatment program, or they can go into AA or Narcotics Anonymous at least, and start to get that community awareness. Become part of a bigger picture of care for themselves.
And do you know why
It
they
doesn't always
trusted
work.
you?
Well, because I gave them the time to develop a relationship with them.
Because you weren't forcing solutions.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Forced solutions
Don't
are
work.
also
They
one
don't
of the
work.
biggest drawbacks.
Yeah.
They do not work.
They don't.
I mean, interventions are all well and good, and, okay, well, you can live here if you give up everything, or you can, if you get into treatment, I will help you. So, but forced solutions do not work. What we need to do is we do need to remove ourselves the best that we can, but still have an open door, and, be kind but firm. But I think shutting the door and telling people that unless, I think that is just a big mistake. And I think that happens all the time. When I first got into the field, it was let them hit bottom. That's and having my own experiences with someone who was a family member, it went against everything that my heart was telling me. So trying to handle that situation with letting this person hit bottom was not successful. They became worse, actually. So it was not they were not easy years, you know what I'm saying? So first you get yourself all straightened out, then you have to deal with all the little ones who grew up and they've got their own issues now, and then you're dealing with it all over again. So, but by that time I was a counselor, and it just does not work. I do not think that letting people hit bottom works, but I think we have to take care of ourselves. And I think if there is an open door in that person knows that you're still there to talk, you're still there to help in the ways that you can, but if that person is aggressive and violent, no, you can't live in my home, but I will help you the best way that I can in whatever ways that I can, kind of thing. Not shutting the door and they're out there on their own. Because that knowing, I think having some type of a connection, even though there are some stipulations, it's not a forced solution, but it's a stipulation because you have to protect yourself. I think that's very helpful. That was my experience anyway, with a family member.
Well, it sounds like, we have personal experience. It sounds like we all have personal experience, and I'm thinking, okay, so number one, someone has to want to get treatment.
Absolutely.
Unless, and if, you have to go to the farm, you have to make the appointment with the counselor, and it's, and I don't know, it sounds like in the situation you shared that the individual realized as a result of your counseling that they needed help. So
they came in realizing they needed it to begin with because they knew something wasn't right in their life because it was falling apart around them. But they stayed in counseling I believe, because, as Sharon said, I didn't demand an immediate response. I didn't insist on total abstinence as entrance into therapy.
You didn't say, if you don't do this, I
Right.
won't
I
see
didn't-
you.
yeah, I didn't set
So
up-
there was trust that he
Yeah.
started to build
Yeah.
with you.
And it
which
took
is
a little
important.
while, and sometimes they would go away angry from the sessions because they would bring up points of information or bring up situations that they were helpless about or discouraged about or angry at, and they would carry that feeling out of the session because I didn't take ownership of those feelings. That was something I learned how not to do as a protection for myself. And I think that's where family members, as again, in my own life, my own family, I have family members around a person in my life that was really, entrenched in addiction. And those people somehow learned how to protect themselves, to take care of themselves, even though this other person was this terrible burden. Because they knew they had to. If they didn't take care of themselves, they would have been in the same position perhaps as the person suffering. And so I was glad that those people were around because they helped carry some of the burden along the way. Sharon, we're getting a little near to the end of our time, but what I'd like if you could to do is just summarize 3 things for me. Could you just review again what the 3 main clusters of symptoms are for PTSD?
Yes, flashbacks,
Flashbacks.
where the memory continues over and over to keep replaying the trauma.
Okay.
Avoidance, which
Avoidance,
is
yeah.
emotional numbing.
Yeah.
And hypervigilance, which is where one is which is where a lot of the anxiety comes from. They're always looking and watching out for danger, and they see danger around every corner.
Okay.
So everything feels totally chaotic and all of that. That is one of the things with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. That person is feeling very chaotic inside because they feel danger all around.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hypervigilant, help me again, hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance, avoidance,
Avoidance,
and the first and
Flashbacks.
Flashbacks.
first and foremost is how the memory continues to replay over and over the trauma, so one doesn't have a chance to have a life, because every day you're always thinking of this trauma, you're not getting past it.
And as you said, there are many causes for this disorder. They all include trauma, we heard that clearly. And some examples are accidents, loss of loved ones,
Domestic abuse.
major surgery, domestic abuse, car accidents.
Loss of employment, as you
Yes.
said,
Yeah.
prison stay, sexual assault,
Yeah.
terrorism and war, of
Okay.
course. Any kind of assault, but and also addiction. We'll bring that on because, all of the above. When you're dealing with addiction, you're dealing with a lot of chaos and a lot of trauma emotionally and sometimes physically.
And finally, how are we going to treat this?
Counseling is very important.
Okay.
And it's very important to find a trusted counselor, support person that you feel comfortable with, because one of the things, as we talked about before, for recovery is resolving things. And a person is not going to resolve things if they're not comfortable with their counseling. So, and even as a family member, it's important for us to, for them to feel trust. We can rebuild that sometimes, and then desensitizing, which is facing the fear, working it through, talking about it. And I do want to touch a little bit on the counseling thing. As I know some people who've been in counseling for years and years and years. And what happens is sometimes they go over it and over and over without trying to say, okay, what can I change here? What can I do about it? How can I see things differently? I think that it's important to cry about it, laugh about it, feel your feelings about this experience, however you need to do that with a trusted counselor and support person. And that does take time, but I don't think it takes 10 years,
Right.
A few years, maybe of working things through is appropriate, and then getting on with your life. So, yeah, all of those things are very important, talking through support groups.
Another one I heard you say early on in your presentation was removing ourselves from
Removing
the
ourselves.
circumstances
If-
when we
yes,
can. We may
when
not
we
always
can.
be able to, but if
Yeah.
we can, even if that means going into the next room to avoid whatever's going on in the other room,
Right.
right? I mean, that, it could be that simple.
And if one can get out of the environment temporarily,
To do so.
it's a reprieve and it gives you a breather.
Yes.
So if you can do that, I mean, and everybody can't, that isn't always possible,
Mhm.
but if a person can do that, I think that's healthy, you know, go to whatever,
Yeah.
however you can do that.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, so,
Any other questions?
Is that on?
Not yet. I'm going to say thank you, Sharon, for this wonderful presentation. We very much appreciate you bringing the subject up. And
thank you for having
we
me.
look forward to having you come back again 2 months from now when we're going to be doing another topic that you're going to present for us.
Okay.
And I remind those of you who are viewing the video of this presentation that there will be a post-test subsequent to your watching the video that is on the website along with this video. If you look directly below the window of the video on our TLC Academy page, you will find an icon port for the post-test. So take the post-test, and then Alan will be able to find out that you've done the test and that you've completed the course, and I'll be able to give you credit for it. So again, thank you, Sharon, for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.